In 1904, General Lothar von Trotha issued an order that would seal the fate of the Herero people. Any Herero found within the German border, armed or unarmed, with or without cattle, will be shot. This was not a military strategy. This was the beginning of the first genocide of the 20th century, a systematic campaign of extermination driven by colonial greed and racial hatred. The Herero and Nama people had long lived in the land now known as German Southwest Africa, where their cultures and societies thrived. These were not disorganized tribes, but independent communities with well-established traditions, leadership, and resources, such as vast herds of cattle. The Herero were skilled pastoralists, while the Nama were renowned for their abilities as fighters and traders. However, the arrival of German colonists in the late 19th century would disrupt this balance forever. At first, the German presence was subtle: a few outposts, some railroads, trade agreements. But with time, it evolved into theft. German settlers claimed the best grazing lands. They took water sources. They moved into territory without asking permission. And when the Herero protested, the settlers called in soldiers. The colonial authorities viewed the African population as inferior, useful when cooperative, disposable when not. German soldiers referred to Herero people as black cattle. Civil administrators spoke of cleansing the land. Laws were written to favor whites. African landowners were pushed out. Chiefs were forced into unfair treaties. Those who resisted were punished through beatings or imprisonment. The situation worsened when German companies began seizing Herero cattle, often the only source of wealth and survival for entire communities. Meanwhile, Herero workers were beaten on construction sites, raped in the fields, and paid in scraps. Complaints were ignored. Protests were answered with bullets. In January of 1904, the Herero people had enough. Under Chief Samuel Maharero, they launched a rebellion, organized, targeted, and aimed at reclaiming stolen land. Herero fighters attacked German farms, killed colonial soldiers, and briefly seized control of rural territory. German civilians were warned in advance and allowed to flee. Most of the dead were soldiers. It was a rebellion, not a massacre. But Berlin wanted revenge. The German Empire, embarrassed and enraged, dispatched thousands of reinforcements under the command of General Lothar von Trotha, a man known for his ruthlessness in previous campaigns. Von Trotha was not interested in negotiation. He was not interested in justice. He was interested in extermination. He issued what would later be known as the Extermination Order. In October of that year, von Trotha declared that every Herero man, woman, and child would be driven from the land or killed. His words were chillingly specific. Any Herero found within the German border, armed or unarmed, with or without cattle, will be shot. It was not a military order. It was a death sentence for an entire people. German troops surrounded Herero territory, driving civilians into the desert. Wells were poisoned, waterholes were guarded. Anyone who tried to return was shot. Herero families were forced to walk for days under the burning African sun without food or water. Mothers died beside their children. Elders fell behind and were left to rot. Those who tried to surrender were gunned down or whipped. Some survivors dug holes into the sand, trying to find underground moisture. Others drank animal blood to stay alive. But death was everywhere. Bodies piled up in dry riverbeds. Vultures followed columns of the dying, waiting to feast. Scorched bones littered the plains. Von Trotha monitored this slow-motion slaughter from his headquarters, satisfied that his plan was working. When news of the brutality reached Europe, there was some outrage. A few voices in the German parliament raised concern. Missionaries reported that women had been raped and villages had been burned. But the German government dismissed the critics. The official narrative described the campaign as necessary to restore order. The Herero, they claimed, had brought it on themselves. But this was not discipline. This was genocide. By the end of that first campaign, tens of thousands of Herero had been exterminated. Before the rebellion, there were nearly 80,000 Herero people living in the region. By 1907, fewer than 15,000 remained, and the Nama were next. While the Herero were being chased into the wastelands and slaughtered in silence, the Nama people watched closely. Their communities had also been stripped of land, tricked into false treaties, and subjected to brutal labor. But many still hoped they could avoid the fate of their neighbors. That hope died in 1905. After witnessing the massacre of the Herero, Nama leaders, including Chief Hendrik Witbooi, decided they would not wait for the same end. They launched their own uprising against German forces, smaller in scale but deeply strategic. The Nama used guerrilla tactics, ambushed supply lines, and vanished into rocky highlands after each assault. Their knowledge of the terrain gave them an advantage, but the German response was relentless. Germany declared martial law across the region. Thousands of troops were deployed. Villages were bombed with artillery. Civilians were rounded up and placed in holding pens. Any man carrying a weapon, even a hunting spear, was labeled a rebel. Pregnant women were dragged from their huts. Grandmothers were whipped. Children were beaten in front of their parents. Chief Witbooi was killed during the campaign. Without his leadership, the Nama resistance fragmented. By 1906, thousands of Nama had been captured and imprisoned. But instead of being treated as prisoners of war, they were sent to concentration camps, one of the earliest uses of that term in modern history. The camps were not temporary. They were not protective. They were built to break bodies and erase identities. Shark Island, off the coast near the town of Lüderitz, became the most notorious of them all. Wind-whipped, barren, and surrounded by cold Atlantic waters, the island offered no escape. There were no trees, no shelter, no privacy, only tents, wire fences, and soldiers with rifles. Inmates were starved. Daily rations included a piece of bread the size of a hand and water laced with salt. Diseases like typhus and dysentery spread uncontrollably. Medical care was non-existent. Dead bodies were left in open piles or dumped into the ocean. Survivors were ordered to drag corpses with ropes tied around their necks, then forced to sleep beside the same spots where the dead had rotted. Men were assigned to hard labor. They smashed rocks under the sun, carried steel beams until their shoulders tore open, and worked barefoot on sharp terrain. Women were forced to build roads, carry bricks, and dig trenches. They were also targeted for sexual abuse. German officers and guards used the female prisoners however they pleased. Rape was common and unpunished. Some women were forced into so-called marriages with soldiers, a cover for long-term assault. Children born from these acts were often taken away or left to starve. Scientific researchers from Germany arrived to study the prisoners. Under the false veil of racial science, they measured skulls, took photographs of naked inmates, and performed grotesque experiments. Some inmates were deliberately infected with diseases to observe the effects. Others were beaten or cut so doctors could study wound healing on so-called inferior races. Dozens of decapitated heads were shipped to Germany in crates, labeled for anthropological study. Skulls of dead prisoners were boiled clean and placed in jars. These remains were sent to universities and museums where they were used to promote eugenic theories. No one asked for consent. No one offered apology. The bodies were seen as tools, objects, evidence to prove racist ideology. Outside the camps, German troops continued burning villages. Water sources were poisoned. Cattle were stolen. Children were kidnapped and sold into labor. Some young girls were branded with hot irons to mark their tribal origins, turned into catalogued objects for auction. Missionaries attempted to intervene but were largely ignored. Berlin offered no mercy. The campaign was not just about quelling rebellion. It was about complete racial domination. The indigenous people were labeled savages, subhuman, and unfit for modern society. Inside the camps, suicide became common. Prisoners threw themselves into the sea. Others ran into barbed wire and screamed until they were shot. Hunger drove some to madness. Mothers watched their children die and refused to eat. The camp became a factory of death, one with no gas chambers but with the same outcome: genocide. By the time the camps were closed in 1907, they had already accomplished their goal. Over 75% of the Nama people had been wiped out. Their communities were shattered. Their culture pushed to the brink of extinction. Most survivors were forced into bonded labor under German settlers, their identities erased, their pain silenced. The Herero had been the first to fall. The Nama followed, and the rest of the world looked away. While death stalked the open deserts and prisons of German Southwest Africa, a quieter horror was unfolding in the name of science. In German universities and medical institutions, a new obsession had taken root, one that would later lay the foundation for Nazi ideology. It was the belief that race could be measured, studied, and ranked. And to fuel this research, colonial officials supplied what they called specimens, human remains gathered from Africa. After the extermination orders were issued, German forces began collecting the skulls and bones of their victims with military precision. Soldiers were given explicit instructions to strip corpses, remove heads, and prepare them for shipment. Hundreds of skulls, Herero and Nama alike, were packed into crates and labeled for scientific transport. Some were bleached in boiling water on the very soil where the victims had been killed. Others were simply sent with flesh still attached, leaving the grim task to students in Europe. These remains arrived at prestigious institutions across Germany: the University of Berlin, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, the Museum of Ethnology. There, they were catalogued by racial theorists who believed that the African body was proof of intellectual inferiority. Skull shapes were measured with calipers. Jawbones were compared. Nose angles were sketched in notebooks. None of the victims were named. They were numbered, tagged, reduced to data points in experiments designed to prove white supremacy. The professors and doctors performing these studies were not fringe lunatics. They were respected academics, publishing in journals, lecturing students, and advising government policy. Their conclusions, flawed, biased, and morally bankrupt, would be echoed decades later by Nazi eugenicists who cited the same methodologies when justifying sterilization, medical killing, and genocide. But the experiments in Germany were not limited to bones. Several women from the camps, particularly from Shark Island, were transported alive to serve as subjects in living studies. Some were placed in human zoos, exhibitions designed to show primitive people to the European public. These women were displayed in cages or enclosures, dressed in tribal clothing, and made to perform daily routines under the watch of thousands of curious onlookers. Their pain became entertainment. Other women and men were used in laboratory experiments back in Europe. German doctors infected them with syphilis and tuberculosis. Some were subjected to surgical procedures without anesthetic. One survivor described being injected repeatedly with chemicals that made her vomit blood for days. She was later discarded and left to die in a cell. These stories were not hidden. They were published, celebrated even. In German scientific circles, the colonial laboratories were seen as a treasure trove of research opportunities. Africa was viewed not as a place of human civilization, but as a testing ground for theories about evolution, intelligence, and racial destiny. This dehumanization went hand in hand with economic exploitation. German companies profited from the genocide. Mining firms took over Herero and Nama land, building railways and extracting ore with forced labor. Cotton plantations flourished on confiscated farms, and the bodies of prisoners, living and dead, were used to fuel the economy. In some cases, the corpses were not just studied, they were turned into products. Skin from deceased prisoners was tanned into leather for gloves and bookbindings. Fat was extracted to make soap. Human hair was used in the production of brushes. Though documentation is incomplete, several testimonies and reports confirm that the remains of murdered Africans were commercialized for profit under the guise of scientific use. German newspapers rarely reported on the brutality. When they did, the narrative was framed around discipline, control, and civilizing missions. The idea that the Herero or Nama had been exterminated was denied. They were said to have disappeared or fled. Military officers who oversaw massacres were promoted. Some returned to Germany as national heroes. General Lothar von Trotha, the man who authored the Extermination Order, faced mild criticism in diplomatic circles. But he never stood trial. He was dismissed quietly and allowed to return home, where he lived without punishment. His methods, however, were studied by others and would later serve as inspiration for German officers operating in Eastern Europe during the Second World War. The connection between the Herero and Nama genocide and the Holocaust is not metaphorical. It is historical. The same institutions that studied Herero skulls would later dissect the bodies of Jewish and Roma victims. The same racial theories tested in Namibia would later justify the construction of Auschwitz. The same silence that followed the African genocide would enable a far larger one on European soil. But in the early 20th century, the world was not ready to name these crimes. There were no trials, no reparations, no memorials, only silence, bones, and broken families. The victims' voices were not just silenced in death, they were buried under centuries of European denial. And long after the last shot was fired, their remains continued to sit in museum drawers, labeled with numbers, studied by strangers, forgotten by governments. What began as a colonial rebellion ended as a blueprint for genocide. When the guns fell silent in German Southwest Africa, the genocide had already done its work. More than 80% of the Herero people were gone. Nearly half of the Nama population had been annihilated. Survivors lived with permanent scars, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Entire family lines were extinguished. Oral traditions were interrupted. Languages lost speakers. Villages were reduced to grave sites. But the violence did not stop. It changed shape. After the extermination campaigns ended in 1907, Germany imposed new systems of forced labor. Surviving Herero and Nama people were confined to reserves, often on barren land, and required to carry identification tags around their necks. These metal discs listed registration numbers instead of names. Africans who failed to produce their tag on command could be beaten, jailed, or killed. Many were forced to work on the very farms that had once belonged to their families. They dug trenches, built roads, and hauled stones under German settlers who had seized their land. Marriages were restricted. Travel was forbidden without permits. Children were taken into Christian schools and taught to forget their history. The attempt to erase the Herero and Nama did not end with bullets. It continued through domination. Back in Germany, the genocide faded into historical footnotes. It was rarely taught. It was never prosecuted. No German official stood trial. No apology was issued. The victims were not honored. The bones sent to German universities remained in storage. Exhibits on colonial history omitted the killings or described them as unfortunate consequences of rebellion. A war crime had become a national amnesia. Decades passed. World wars reshaped borders. Germany lost its colonies after the First World War. Namibia was placed under South African administration. But the legacy of German rule did not vanish. The racial hierarchies remained. So did the land theft. So did the silence. For the Herero and Nama people, survival became a daily act of resistance. They preserved songs and ceremonies in secret. Elders told children stories that colonial officials had tried to erase. Graves were maintained without permission. In some cases, memory itself became a kind of rebellion. When Namibia gained independence in 1990, the survivors and descendants of the genocide began to speak more openly. They called for recognition. They demanded reparations. They wanted the bones of their ancestors returned. They wanted Germany to say the word it had avoided for nearly a century: genocide. At first, Germany refused. Officials acknowledged that terrible things had happened, but stopped short of using legal language. The killings were described as excesses, mistakes, or a dark chapter. Attempts to file lawsuits in international courts were blocked. Requests for formal reparations were dismissed on legal grounds. Germany argued that the United Nations definition of genocide did not exist at the time, and therefore, the acts could not be prosecuted retroactively. This denial deepened the wound. Activists organized protests in Berlin. They marched through the streets holding photos of the genocide, chanting in Ochi Herero and Nama. Academics wrote books. Journalists exposed archival documents. Survivors traveled to Germany, demanding to see the remains of their ancestors. They spoke in parliament halls. They stood in front of museums. They reminded the world that the first genocide of the 20th century had never been acknowledged. Slowly, cracks began to appear. In 2004, exactly 100 years after the Extermination Order, Germany issued a public statement expressing regret. A government minister admitted that crimes had been committed, but still, no reparations were offered. No legal responsibility was accepted. Over the next decade, pressure mounted. International human rights groups, historians, and African nations joined the call for justice. Eventually, in 2016, Germany began negotiations with the Namibian government to reach a formal agreement. It took 5 more years of debate, compromise, and resistance before an official recognition was made. The German government publicly declared that the killings of the Herero and Nama constituted genocide. It pledged to fund development projects in Namibia totaling over €1 billion, but stopped short of calling them reparations. The money would be distributed over 30 years, aimed at education, infrastructure, and cultural preservation. But many Herero and Nama descendants rejected the deal. They argued that the agreement had been made without proper consultation. They said that development aid was not justice. They demanded direct compensation. They asked for the return of stolen land, the return of bones, and a full apology spoken to the communities, not to foreign governments. They were not asking for charity. They were asking for dignity. And still today, many of their demands remain unmet. German institutions have returned some human remains. Ceremonies have been held in Berlin and Windhoek, but hundreds of skulls and bones have not been repatriated. Museums still hold artifacts taken during the genocide. German textbooks rarely mention the events. Monuments to the victims are small, often hidden or vandalized. The pain remains raw, but memory endures. Every year, the Herero and Nama hold commemorations. They wear traditional clothing. They sing resistance songs. They walk the same desert paths where their ancestors were hunted. They speak the names of the dead, not as victims, but as people who stood, who resisted, and who must never be forgotten. Because the genocide was not just a moment in history, it was a warning. It showed the world what happens when racial hatred meets unchecked power, when science is used to justify cruelty, when human lives are reduced to numbers and data. It taught the world how silence kills, how ignoring suffering does not erase it but extends it. And though the Herero and Nama genocide was once forgotten, it now forces itself into memory, uncomfortable, painful, and essential. Because if we do not speak of it, we risk repeating it.